Hello, and welcome to Sacred Scars Stories of Religious Trauma and Healing, where we explore the journey of healing from religious trauma. Today's episode may touch on sensitive topics. If you find it challenging, please practice self-care, take breaks, talk to someone you trust, or consider seeking professional help such as therapy and/or spiritual direction. Let's dive into this week's episode on religious trauma, mental health, systemic trauma, and suicidal ideation in the Guyanese context, with my friend and colleague, Dennis, whom I'll have introduce himself.
Hi, everyone. My name is Dennis Saavedra Carquin-Hamichand. I use he, him pronouns. And I am currently a student in a joint doctoral program with the University of Denver and the Iliff School of Theology. And that's where C and I met at Iliff. And currently my research is I'm doing a religious studies program. And my research is focused on looking at ways to find ways for suicide prevention and intervention in Guyana, where I grew up, and really seeing how we could reduce the rates of suicide there because it's a major problem. The rates are really high, and really part of me is I won't really want to work in that context and really address this specific issue. So that's where my research is heading right now. And I'll look at it from a religious context because Guyana is a very, and I'm saying religious country because most people in Guyana identify with a religion. Um, According to some recent polls, it shows that 64% of the country identifies with Christianity and like 20 something with Hinduism, and then about 7% with Islam. And then there are some smaller indigenous and African religions that people practice there. But if you were to go to Guyana, you'll feel the presence of Christianity there. You'll see churches everywhere, but you'll also feel Hinduism is also very present as well. So, doing my research from this like perspective of really understanding religion and the role it can play in suicide prevention, I think is a very important one for me.
And I am often by the research that you're doing, and it has actually brought you into visiting Guyana a few times already for some of this research, as well as you've spoken at conferences a lot on some of your other research. So I'd love to hear some of your experiences first, like visiting Guyana and some of the things that you've learned.
Yeah. So I'll just I'll think of last year alone. I was in Guyana twice last year. One for a conference and then one to do specific research on suicide, where I had a couple focus groups that I facilitated, just to get a sense of what people are thinking about suicide, the perspectives people have on suicide, and those really uh, in a way reinforce some of the things had already knew about suicide in Guyana and how people think about it. So when I was there earlier in the spring last year, I spoke with a couple people. These were just like individuals, and suicide is such a like taboo subject, that people don't really talk about it often. But when I brought it up that this is the research I'm doing, I think people became a little bit more at ease and were more willing to share their experiences and really talk about how suicide impacts them. And one of the things that happened, one of a close family friends started sharing her experience with suicidal ideation and even attempts. And I was really surprised by this because this person is really Christian, very devout. And to even say that she attempted suicide was a surprise to me because um, in Christianity, or the Christianity that we grew up in, the very Pentecostal Christianity, we're told that suicide or even attempting suicide or even thinking about suicide is a sin. but you can't like really tell people what to think, but I think people do. And so for her to even say she had like suicidal ideation and she's been struggling with suicidality, I was really like shocked by it. And that had me thinking about like people are really struggling with suicide in Guyana, you know? We don't have a robust like mental health um, infrastructure to really help people like talk through like these internal struggles that they're having. So they're having to rely on religion to really help them in this. And for many people, you know, Christianity is where they turn to because it presents itself as a religion of hope, right? And for many people, it is. And for many people, they're still struggling to find that hope, you know? Um, so when this person was sharing, I was like, wow, I was just really like taken aback because I wasn't prepared for this response or for her to share her personal experience with suicidality. And I was and that really reinforced how much more important it is for us to really talk about it, because if we continue keeping it in the background and just think, oh, if we don't talk about it it'll go away, it just continues. And so part of my research is really to address that, like silence around suicide, especially from a religious context, and really engage with folks to see how we can develop strategies that can really like encourage, like for me, churches, and this is like Christian churches, to really be that place that can help people who are struggling and find ways to not judge, because that's the biggest thing. We're judging before we're really helping folks, you know. And that's like, I think, you know, the once you see it as a sin, it becomes very problematic, because when we and yeah, and I think not having like uh, specific places or outlets to really address it, I think people will continue to rely on the church and the theology that comes out of there, the ethics that comes out of there, to really like give them that feeling of control over their own like emotions um and personal struggles with suicide, right? And then the second time I went to Guyana, I did a couple focus groups with predominantly Christians. Well, I said predominant, all Christians. They were all Christian individuals, and they came and my goal for those focus groups was to get a sense of what people are thinking about suicide, their perspectives. And most people had a similar perspective on suicide. They think it's a sin. They think people don't have good coping skills. Um, they think sometimes it's very impulsive. People like get out of a relationship, they don't know what to do, so they either choose to die by suicide or attempt suicide. Um, so those were some of the like common themes that came out of that. And for me, growing up in Guyana, those were some of the things I've seen as well, and the same rhetoric I've heard growing up there. And then I think the biggest one for me, and I think I had also had carried this perspective, was that we blame Hinduism for suicide, and that was one of the main themes that came out of that. And and it just reminded me that I also had carried that perspective when I was living there, because Christianity in Guyana were, when you convert from Christianity, you're told that you have to give up everything of your former self or of your former life. And for most people, especially the Indo-Guyanese folks, those people who came from different parts of Asia, Hinduism was a big part of their cultural and religious identity. So to tell them when you convert to Christianity, you have to give that up, it it's really painful, and people don't see it immediately because when you've lived a certain way for generations and then you're told, oh, actually that's wrong, it really does something to yourself, and that's what Christianity has been doing there.
Yeah.
um, are really promoting that message of you have to convert, um, or else, because Hinduism is, I has a lot of idols. It's like idolatry, it's sinful. Only the Christian God is, um, you know, the one that can offer salvation or liberation. So those are the like things that people struggle with. So then when you talk about suicide and in Guyana, majority of the people that die by suicide are Indo-Guyanese. So it then becomes easier to blame Hinduism, for the high rates. And yeah, so that's one of the main things I saw. This continuous blaming of Hinduism, and I guess for me as an outsider, and I'm kind of an insider outsider. I've lived in the U.S. for a few years now, so I have a different perspective of looking back to Guyana. So like seeing it from this position from the academy in the US, I think I'm having a different understanding of suicide, and a different understanding of religion as well. Um, and and I and not to I think part of my research is not to impose what I'm learning here there, but to work with the communities for us to find um, strategies that are like culturally acceptable and meaningful to the communities that are not just trying to take away ways of being, because I feel like that'll be that perpetuation of this like colonizer mindset of like this is it, this is the one way. But we need to find different strategies. So I said a lot there. I'll take a breath, and let you jump in.
Yeah, it all sounds super fascinating. And from like a mental health provider perspective, I see where a lot of like the identity struggles might come into play with some of the suicidality of like needing to give your all to a religion. And then mm, you gave your all to a religion, and now, well, what am I? Who am I? Kind of things kick in, and then in comes like depression and other mental health symptoms that might activate feelings of suicidality or thoughts of suicidality, which then could activate even more things. So it's
Oh yeah.
fascinating to hear all of that and exploring like how to best connect with this community and not really come in from a colonizer perspective. Because I think it's so easy for folks, especially folks in academia doing research studies, to like go into a space, do all this research, and be like, here's some evidence-based things from these other things.
No.
Let's implement it here and not really take in the full perspective of a culture and cultural considerations, which then begs questions of like research ethics and stuff. Being someone who's studying these things, I'm sure you are already certified with a research ethics thing at DU. I know I had to do that training myself, and they go very in depth on those ethics. And yet, a lot of studies still today kind of begs questions of ethics regarding cultural consideration, especially when it comes to mental health.
Oh yeah, yeah, and that's one thing I'm like really cautious about doing. Um, in research we call it positivism, where the researcher has all the knowledge, and they come in and they're like, oh yeah, we need to fix this way, without considering the context, the culture, ways of being for people. So yeah, so part of me, I'm as I'm gonna start this research, it's to pay attention to when my own experience is coming into to influence the way people are responding to different I guess research questions. And not to say I wouldn't that wouldn't play a role in it, but I think having an awareness of where it's coming in, I think it's very important because we we can't assume that everything we know from um, reading all the books and studying all the theories will make sense in Guyana, because people are thinking of things more locally and more uh, within their communities. If someone like in Guyana, so many people are dying by suicide. The rates are like 40.3 for every 100,000, which doesn't sound like a lot, but then when you compare it like globally, um, countries are having much lower rates, you know. And part of it's our population is really like uh, small. We're just over 800,000 in Guyana, but I think that there is this like continuation that like since the WHO started recording deaths by suicide in Guyana in the 2000s, those rates have remained like the same. So really looking at that and really trying to, I think there are a lot of NGOs that are going down to Guyana um, to do research and to really change the culture. But I think they're coming in with this. We have the knowledge. We know we've seen what's working in the US or elsewhere, and we're bringing that there. And even though some of it might work, I think you have to like work closely with the communities that are mostly impacted, and that's what I think I really want to focus on, like really community based like work where I'm engaged with folks there and seeing what they're trying, seeing how my research can support that, and create that kind of engagement, and not thinking I know like, oh, this has been working here, because part of it, a lot of it is not um, only like mental health uh, illnesses that people are struggling with, or different kinds of mental health issues. One research recently showed that a lot of it is a lot of impulsive acts, like people are angry or upset, and then they choose to die by suicide, like um, and really looking at how we could slow people down. Like this shouldn't be your go-to like thing, um, and really addressing it from that perspective. What can we do as a community to help people who might consider suicide? Um, and that's, yeah, and that's where I'm really like paying attention to, as my social location is different now um, than when I was living in Guyana, you know. So really paying attention to that, and paying attention to my own expertise and how that's influencing people's like ways of thinking, and giving them more voice, to name the issue and also to name the strategies that they think can work, because it's happening within their community, And I keep saying there, but I'm also part of that community. So yeah.
Yeah. And it seems like there's more trust with like folks in Guyana seem to have more trust with you coming in as like both like a outsider and an insider, of being able to have more in-depth conversations about suicidality because of some of those taboos. It seems like there's more trust.
Yeah. At least when I was working, when I was doing the focus groups, I felt like, yeah, people trusted me, and also I framed it in a kind of like ethnographic kind of way, where
Uh,
I wasn't trying to influence them in what they're saying. I was a part of the conversation. We're sitting in a circle, but I was letting them lead the discussion, without trying to impose my views. I wanted to hear from them. And I think once they recognized that, people started just sharing much more freely, you know? And they know I'm there. It's not like I'm hiding somewhere. And I was a part of the conversation, but I think letting them know that upfront that I'm here, but I'm also not going to try to, I just want to hear y'all talk about it as a community. And the conversations were just like so in depth um, and nuanced. Like people would say one thing and then someone would come with a counter argument, and it was just, I think, part of me, it was kind of exciting to see that the community knows what's going on, and um they're just willing to talk about it. It's just that the space is usually not there. So that was really like, um from my research perspective, it seemed like a good thing for me. But I'm wondering what would be the discussion if I were to have a group of like Hindus, people who practice Hinduism, talk about it and see what their perspectives, or even folks who are Muslims, and maybe divide those groups and talk to them separately, and then bring all of them together and see what that conversation would look like. Could be interesting research. And my hope is that, I know Christianity is so dominant, sometimes it dominates conversation. So maybe then I'll have to be a little bit more involved in like making sure all voices are heard.
Yeah.
Um, and yeah, so yeah, it's a lot. Yeah. Sorry, I
Um,
didn't get that.
I said especially with two Abrahamic religions because they have similar roots.
Yeah, yeah. But Islamic Guyana is very like much in the minority. So usually you hear a lot about Guyana. It's a lot of Christianity and Hinduism. Um, the You don't hear too much about Islam, especially like in research. It's Yeah, you whenever you read an article that or a research, Islam will have a small like section, and then Christianity will have this like major section, and then Hinduism will have a little, closer to Christianity, but it's really smaller. And then you have the indigenous religions and the African religions like that you never really hear from too much. So those are the dynamics. Really trying to see how we can work from those perspective. And um, I don't know. I think it's a difficult thing changing ideology, but I think education in terms of like making people more aware of why these things are happening, I think could um, help change the perspective on it. And that's why I'm more focused on the perspective than trying to change people's like religious views, you know?
Yeah.
Uh, so yeah.
Yeah. I think like the larger like focus on Christianity and the research also speaks volumes on impacts of colonization,
Oh
especially
yeah.
with like indigenous like faith backgrounds seem to be the least of research topics.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. And Guyana was colonized by two European countries. First the Dutch, and then the British um, colonizers, and they were there for a long time. The Dutch, started in the 17th century. They exploited the indigenous people, which if you were to go to Guyana, you'd see the coastal area in Guyana is where the majority of the population lives. It's a really small area, but the I want to say the majority, like 70% of the population live on the coastal region. And then because of this kind of exploitation by these colonizers, the indigenous people were living there before they arrived, and they were, engaged in fishing and all these kinds of things. And once the Dutch entered, they started to exploit the indigenous people to work on plantations, work on different things that they were doing in the country. And so that after a while, indigenous people start to like retreat, and they go farther into like the jungles of Guyana. So if you were to go to Guyana, you'd see a lot of indigenous communities in the interiors, and now they're more relationship with indigenous people coming to like the coastal areas, and um, engaging in the markets, and they've established their communities in these areas. So you see that like shift, you know, of like this impact of colonization. And then the British came in, and they're like, oh, we don't need the indigenous people. We're already enslaving African, um, and so they had this much more um, intense like exploitation of like humans and that kind of resources, and bringing them to the Caribbean, the U.S., everywhere, and having them work on these plantations. And then in the 19th century, um, when the slavery was abolished, um, they and Africans, enslaved Africans, were emancipated. They still didn't want to leave, and they're like, we got to find a different way of ensuring we're profiting from these plantations in Guyana, but also in like different parts of the Caribbean. And that's when they um, they started the indenture laborer, who they were bringing from Asia, predominantly India, um, and they started bringing those folks who were like working under these contracts for 3 to 7 years period. And they're told that after their time, they can either go back to India or China, wherever they were coming from, and or they can remain in Guyana, continue working um, as free laborers, and they can buy land and different things. So if you were to go to Guyana, uh, most people who own like a lot of land are Indians, because they had that privilege. Because even after the emancipation, the enslaved Africans weren't given this opportunity in the same way, to have access to land. So then that indentureship lasted for like 80 years, and then Guyana was struggling in the 20th century to like gain its independence, to become post-colonial, and they gained independence in 1966, which you know you see all this transition. But I'm saying all this history because of this colonization is such a big part of Guyana, and it's not that long ago that we were colonized. We were colonized and living in this framework of being a colonies in the 20th century, and we got to the mid 20th century where a lot of places were gaining independence at the same time, and Guyana was one of those places. And you can still feel it because um, the colonization shifted, and in the academy we call it neo-colonization now, where different forces are controlling the country, still extracting resources, and then we enter into this like neoliberal or globalization phase where we're trying to do free market, but free market only goes one way, and it goes north from Guyana. It's like it's not an equal relationship. So these things are still impacting us, and that's why so many like one of my like I don't know if I'll write a whole chapter on this, but in my dissertation, but I'm thinking like I have to really examine the missionary impact on our people and how that become part of this neo-colonization, and how that plays a role in continuing the Euro-American domination that continues in places like Guyana, because then the tinker at ILIF, the professor of indigenous like traditions in the U.S. for ILIF. I don't know his exact title, but he talks about this like Christian worldview as being so pervasive. He don't see it as a religion. He sees it as this worldview that tells uh, white people that they have the power to dominate, and that all stems from this manifest destiny and all these kinds of things that we talk about this a lot in our program, that where certain groups have more power and privilege than others, and in some way that give them the right to then dominate. And yeah, so all of that, like the history of Guyana, it's such a like intense history that we really have to look at it. We can't like say, oh, let's look at what's going on now and don't worry about the past. I think it all like ties together, and impacts what's going on now.
Yeah.
Yeah. Sorry, I give you a little history lesson there, but guy.
I think it's applicable though, because it feeds a lot into a lot of that trauma of the colonization, especially like the Euro-American colonization, manifest destiny, which comes from a lot of like colonial like Christian beliefs in the Catholic. Yeah, it was the Catholic Church that even had the doctrine of discovery that like
Yeah.
basically they use to manipulate biblical texts to give them like the ability to colonize in their own like way of like ethics and stuff.
Yeah. I just want to like say one thing about the doctrine of discovery. So ILIF just had a class in the winter by this professor. His name is Stephen Newcomb. I don't know if you're familiar with his work. Um, so he talks about the doctrine of discovery, um, and he did this whole class on it. And he used his text that he wrote, "Pagans in the Promised Land," as the primary text for that class. So I sat in one session, and it was yeah, it was really intense to like learn about this history. And part of it, he said, is you have to look at language when certain things are written. Pay attention to how certain words are used, to promote this sense of domination. So yeah, I just wanted to like add that there.
Yeah, fascinating. I wish I had known about that ahead of time, or else I probably would have asked if I could audit the class or something.
Yeah.
But that's so fascinating. But like also I utilize like the terms of manipulation of the text versus like mistranslation because a lot of people use mistranslation. But I use manipulation intentionally oftentimes when it comes to the displacement of power because
Hmm.
it is a manipulation of the text, given the ability, like the way how they are using the words and the translations of the text to enable them to have power over another,
Hmm.
to oppress like marginalized communities and stuff.
Oh
Versus
yeah.
translation would be just like mistaking like there for them or something like that would be a mistranslation.
Oh yeah. Yeah. It's how they describe hegemony. It's like we don't live where you're like physically oppressed and dominated, but we live in this like subtle way of domination, where in a way we as like people who are constantly oppressed buy into it because it's not as pervasive as like slavery or indentureship, you know? So it's like, yeah, it's I think it leads to this kind of gaslighting, like, oh, but you're a part of it. Like, it's okay. It's not as bad as it was, you know? So yeah. So I think I see that like playing out how we like engage with with the culture and as you're saying, the language that's constantly used, we can't really escape it, you know? And that's the struggle. Like, how do we develop um, a way to resist this oppression that's like telling us it's not that bad? Um,
Yeah.
yeah.
And that kind of relates to one of your recent like conference presentations on a lot of that trauma.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. So I recently presented at the Society for Race, Ethnicity, and Religion at ILIV. They had a conference at ILIV. And that was one of the things I was reflecting on because the theme for the conference was, I might be messing it up, but it's in the vein of resisting apartheid America. Um, and I think that might be the title of Delatorre's book. So, but it's in that vein, like resisting apartheid in some way. And so I was talking about it because I talk about as an immigrant in the US, you feel this outsider status. Even if you're told like, oh, it's okay. You're not an outsider. You're already here. You're assimilated to the culture. You know. So I was looking at like the different kinds of policing, like living in New York. You were there earlier when we first moved. They had this program of stop and frisk that would happen like all the time. You can be walking down the street and the police can stop you and just check if you have drugs or guns. I don't know, whatever they wanted to find. Um, so, but it was so bad. It was happening in the subway, and every time they stop you, they're like, "Oh, this is a random stop," and you're like, "But I see all these other people like not being randomly stopped," and and you know that eats away at your inside, like eats away at your sense of self because you're like, now you're like starting to police your own self because you're trying to not draw attention, you know? And it's this like, in a way, you're trying to assimilate to whiteness. It's like, how can I be more white? Because you already recognize that that's the only thing that's not being subjected to these like different forms of policing, you know? So yeah, so then you start to do different things that would, I don't know, ease the trauma that you're feeling. And I talk about this concept of complex PTSD, which is a which I don't know if I have the book. Oh yeah, so it's from this book from.
I've
Did you read it?
I've been meaning to buy it. I've heard a lot of good things about that book.
Yeah, so it's Natalie Gutierrez, and she talks about it, and this is such a good. I've read this book like 4 times already, and it's for me it's such a good book because it
Okay.
helped me to. Sorry.
You mind saying the title though for those who might be just listening and not watching the video?
Oh yeah, it's The Pain We Carry: Healing from Complex PTSD for People of Color. The author is Natalie Y. Gutierrez. And yeah, if you want a really like uh book to really help ground you and help you like to develop some of the language if you don't have the language in naming that like um like struggle to assimilate or struggling towards whiteness that you know you can't really accomplish, but you know that if you try hard enough, you can maybe avoid attention to yourself. This book was really helpful for me in terms of that because it helped me to name, oh, this is what I'm feeling. That's that complex PTSD, the constant microaggressions, the constant random stops that makes you feel uh like you're always being watched, or like you're not like good enough, you know?
Yeah.
And how that like really destroys your sense of self. So yeah, so that was what I was presenting on at this conference, really talking about um culture. This is like some of the things as an immigrant, as a brown person, you have to like deal with, because even if you're Christian, you think that would give you some kind of clout in the US. It doesn't. I've spent time in churches that are predominantly white, and you're still the outsider in those spaces, even though you're technically worshiping the same God. Um, but yeah, so it was, so it's those things I was really addressing in that, like, in that paper, in that conference, really talking about these like internal struggles that we have, and how part of ourself tells us we should assimilate to the culture. And another book that I'm really like, that really transformed my thinking, is Frantz Fanon, Black Skin, White Mask. And he talks about how that becomes pathological, trying to wear a white mask in a white society with your black skin. And he said that leads to alienation, you know? And so really thinking through those are the things I'm really like wrestling with. How do we live authentically in a space that constantly tells you you're an other, an outsider? You're the them, you're not the us. So that's what I've been really like struggling with, and really thinking through. Um and that's where you see, and I always think about it, in Guyana, we're very like much very Christian. It's a very meaningful space for a lot of people who identify with Christianity. They find a lot of hope and a lot of meaning, right? But then it also like creates this otherness as well, within us, because once you convert to Christianity in Guyana, you then feel like you're told like you gain this sense of superiority. So now your goal is to convert other people, and you're perpetuating the same cycle of like, we're not this, we're striving for something that we're not. um and I see that as a constant struggle, and I always have to pay attention to that. um yeah, because I don't know, and part of, for me, is recognizing that it's not achievable. You're never gonna live into whiteness, the circle of domination. You're never gonna get close to that center. You're always, if that's your goal, you know so I think, recognizing that I can't do it, and I'm saying but I'm thinking like for the community as well, that we can't get there. um so that recognition, I think, can be liberating in some ways, because then you're like, I can't do it, and I just have to live authentically. um so yeah.
And it, like, even it seems very like almost caste to me in terms of like being a part of like Christianity, and now like you gotta go like now you're kind of like at a higher level and you gotta go spread that Christian like belief system.
Yeah, yeah, it's part of like what you're told, like when you convert to Christianity in Guyana, you're told that one of the mission of the church is to bring more souls into the church, into like, um and yeah, and it's easy to buy into, because Christianity, it's against a lot of like things that are like seemingly sinful, like you can't consume alcohol, because that could lead to alcoholism and addiction and different kinds of things. And those are good, like, but restricting people's choices then becomes even more problematic. If someone wants to drink socially, can the church really like dictate that and tell him? But that's what it does. And so then I think we find so many things to blame on Hinduism, and that's why I keep seeing there's a tension between Christianity and Hinduism because um, we're always saying that it contributes to a lot of these behaviors, that the ethics or the morals of the religion is a bit more loose than, and this is very much like um, just people are thinking these things. It's not, I think, grounded on any form of like Hindu philosophy or teachings. It's just based on assumptions, and so really like challenging those, I think, also is a way of for us to resist our own Christian um, attitudes of domination that we're talking about.
Yeah,
Yeah.
makes sense. And it seems like there's a lot to deconstruct. So there's a lot constructed and put in out of the Christian missionary kind of thought pattern.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, there's a lot. Um, and that's part of like I think my journey in doing an MDiv at ILIF. It really helped me to gain that sense of clarity, um, and to really think more critically of Christianity. It's the religion I identify with. Um, it's the religion my entire family identify with. So, and I think being such a for it being such a big part of our identity, of our way of living, I think we are also responsible for critiquing it in very constructive ways that can be more life-giving, more liberating for people, because we're the ones that are practicing it, so we have some sense of responsibility. And that's what I feel like, I struggle. I go back and forth sometimes, but I struggle with this identity as Christian because I don't know Hinduism. Um, you know, I was raised in it. I don't understand the philosophies. I haven't done much um, like studies on the practices. I really fully engaged in it to know it in depth as compared to how I know like Christianity and the things that we're taught, and the things we're expected to live by. So that's why I feel like we have that responsibility as people who identify with the religion, um, to hold different things accountable. Um, you know, and there are a lot of, you see it in the U.S. Lots of racism that comes out of Christianity as well. Sexism, homophobia and transphobia, all these kinds of things. And how can we be the ones to say, let's pay attention to what we're doing? We're promoting liberation, but who are we promoting liberation for? And can we really take some time and take stock of what we're, promoting? And that's another group, the LGBTQIA plus community in Guyana is one of the most vulnerable groups to suicide. Um, you know, because of uh, the the farther like the marginalization that they feel within that society. You know,
Yeah.
so there are a lot of groups trying to work with the LGBTQ community there, that yeah, the violence is just sometimes it seems acceptable because, of like this Christian narrative that folks who are queer are like living a life in sin. And you're like, when this definition of sin becomes so narrow that we want people to conform to our way of living, we have to reevaluate that, and that's part of that deconstruction. How do we we are already constructed these like narrow spaces? How can we like broaden them? How can we dismantle this structure? If we're preaching a message of hope and liberation, how can we challenge our own beliefs? Because if we're conceiving of this like eternal heaven as someplace safe for us, what does that mean for people who don't identify like the way we do? Do they not have that same space, or can they not enter that same space with the same expectation that we are entering, or are they going to constantly be judged? You know, so yeah, so those are some of the things I really have to deconstruct, because our religion is like it builds those walls, and then we're left with living within them, or expected to live within them. And part of it is like we shouldn't question things that are already established. And you're like, but those are the things we need to question. Like, if it were to be liberating for everyone, and a safe space for everyone, And I think that's part of why my research, um, I feel like it's important, because it's not going to just look at suicide from this narrow lens of like, let's focus on mental health, but we got to focus on what is the rhetoric coming out of the religion, out of the church, that can like contribute to people feeling this sense of like, or leading to like suicidal ideation when they're struggling with so much. They're struggling with their identity. They might be struggling with mental health, like different issues with mental health. They might be struggling with poverty, like, you know, still living in with the trauma, the historical trauma from colonization. And it's so like intertwined that we can't just say, let's focus on just one aspect of it. Um, and that's a big project. And I don't think I can do it all by myself, but I think that's why working on it collaboratively we can all like figure out ways of addressing different things,
Yeah.
um, yeah, because we have to deconstruct a lot of things, um, because it's, I don't know, it continues to harm so many people. And suicide is just one of those things. We look at it um, from an individual lens, where we're like, oh, that person didn't know what to do, or we blame the person,
Yeah.
instead of looking at the structures that lead to people like choosing to die by suicide.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it also like with the impacts of there being like a lot of homophobia and transphobia, is there also, because like as you noted, like colonization and stuff can also result in things like sexism and racism and stuff. Is that also present within the Guyanese context of racism, or even colorism and sexism also being present within that?
Oh yeah. Yeah. It's um it's a really big issue. Um Sexism, it's a major issue in Guyana. Uh, it's played out in the church a lot, because women aren't allowed to take up like leadership roles in the church in terms of like pastoral roles, um, because of like biblical scriptures that is interpreted in the way that God is the head, and then the man is the head, and then the woman is below the man, and those kinds of hierarchies. So that leads to a lot of sexism, um, and you see it play out a lot in the church. And I think that's not even just limited to Guyana. We see that here in the U.S. too. Different like organizations wouldn't want to ordain women as pastors. So that's one of the biggest issues there. It's Yeah, it's a major issue.
Yeah.
The issue in colorism, it's a really big issue, but for me, I think it's a little bit less when you're uh, a cisgender man. I think men have a little bit more privilege there. You can be lighter. If you're lighter, you might benefit from different things. In Guyana, you might gain a little more privilege, but I think it's more. Um, I see it play out more for women having to give into that culture. They sell a lot of like products to lighten your skin and like different kinds of things. So maybe I'm not too knowledgeable on it, but that's how I've seen it play out in Guyana. Yeah, because it's so like it's such a like how would I describe it? Like a macho culture. If a man were to like use something to lighten his skin, he'd then because of the like um, anti-LGBTQ culture that is so pervasive, you'll then become like I guess teased in a way of being like queer as something like negative. So yeah, so it's a lot of that like tied into um, this like culture of like sexism, colorism. But I haven't done much work on colorism in terms of like um, for men, and I really don't know too much about it.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, but I just remember one time my grandmother was like, "Dennis, you have to stay out of the sun. You're getting too dark." I'm like, Guyana is all sun. Like that's like really an impossible task, especially for a culture where we're so much more outdoors. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I just ask because I largely know that like a lot of the countries with similar histories, it seems like colorism and sexism are also really prominent issues.
Oh yeah.
The lighter your skin is, the more privilege you're gonna have
Oh
oftentimes.
yeah. 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 You feel it and you see it. Um, yeah.
So it seems like there's a lot to assess regarding like suicidality within the community in Guyana between the lasting impacts of colonization, the current religious context with the different religions, and even the blame on specific religions.
Oh yeah. There's so much to do. I don't know how much I'll get done in my dissertation research, but I'm still like trying to figure that out because one of the goals in a PhD program is to get it done. so,
Yeah.
so I don't know how much I can accomplish within the next couple of years, but I don't see it as like just for my dissertation. I see it as a longer project beyond that dissertation. So I don't know. Hope
Dissertation stepping
I
stone.
hope we can. Yeah, I hope we can figure out different ways of really reducing those rates because it's it's too high, and we know so many people who are dying by suicide. Like in 2020, one of my close friends died by suicide, and I think that really like prompted me wanting to do this research more. Um, but I think growing up in Guyana, you just know, like, and I think over time you develop this like callousness towards it. Like someone died by suicide. Oh, you're like, oh, well, it's another person, and that's the feeling that you get. But I don't know. I hope we can change it where it becomes something that really impacts us much more intensely. That we're gonna try our best to like figure out ways to help, you know. And I'm not saying that people don't want to help, it's just we don't like have the resources or the infrastructure to do that. But one of the good things that happened recently in 2022, they changed the law, which was a colonial era law, that criminalized people who attempted suicide. I don't think it was overtly enforced, but anything that's in law could eventually become enforced in certain ways. So changing that was, I think, a big win for this work, because you don't want something that next, how government shifts and changes.
Yeah.
If they were to a certain government started becoming more, let's enforce the law, or becoming more law and order like we hear in the U.S. um, that could have become more harmful for people who are struggling with suicidality. So that was a big change, which I was really happy to hear. It happened so quickly that I didn't even expect it to happen. Um,
Yes.
Not that it happened quickly, it took a long time, but like from when they were discussing it in Parliament to like when it changed, I was like, wow, that was actually pretty quick. Um, so yeah, so hopefully that'll that's helping us move into this like space where we can really like create a lot of change. And um I met a researcher recently on Zoom. We talked, and she's doing work in Guyana, and one of her main agendas is to uh, help Guyana find ways to use non-lethal uh, pesticide, because that's the main way people die by suicide in Guyana, ingesting poison, and usually it's the pesticides that they're using for the farms. Um, and her research showed that there are a lot of like pesticides that are available, that are not lethal, or even if you ingest some of it, you don't like die like really quickly. If you were to go to a hospital and get the right treatment, you could survive. So I think that's also a really important project. Um, Her name is Charlotte Shaw, and yeah, hopefully I can collaborate with her eventually, um, as I go down there and do my own research. Yeah, but I thought, because I never think about like taking away the means, um, and see how that can shift the like numbers. Um, but I think it's important, and that's why I say I can't do it alone, because everyone might have a different um, approach. So yeah.
Interesting. That sounds like a fascinating study as well. Um,
Yeah, it was really like I read it and I'm like, I need to talk to this person. So I emailed her, and she, it was amazing how quickly she got back to me, and then and she's like, yeah, I'm open to talking. And I'm like, really? I don't know. Sometimes I'm nervous talking to academics because they scare me. Sometimes, they're like, um, I don't want to talk to you. But it was really refreshing that she was so open to having this conversation. Um, so yeah, so I'm hoping we can collaborate and maybe just talk through different ideas and things. So yeah, and she's not focused on religion, so she was happy that I was focused on this aspect of religion as well. So yeah, our work seems like um, there's some neutrality in our work because we're doing it from different perspectives,
Yeah,
but we're trying to accomplish the same goal. Yeah.
it's interesting.
Yeah.
And then, oh, actually, we went over time, but do you have any like last remarks or any comments you'd like to say in closing to our audience?
Um, yeah, well, I just, I think anyone who's like struggling with suicidality, if you can access resources, access those resources, talk to someone, because most times people are feeling lonely and really like needing someone to connect with. And my hope is that suicide isn't the first or isn't your first like action, like choosing to die or. And I'm hoping people can have um, alternatives, different ways of dealing with the different struggles that people deal with um, in terms of these internal struggles that we have. So take time. If you can talk to people, talk to people. Whatever you can do to take care of yourself, do it. And that's what my work is trying to do, is uh, trying to create alternatives for folks in Guyana. So I know in the US there are more alternatives, but sometimes they seem inaccessible. Um, but hopefully, um, find those now. So if a moment arises where you're struggling, that you can tap into it. So yeah, so that's my thing. And if religion offers you hope, and prayer and singing and whatever, going to a mass or a service, you know, I always recommend that because um, my goal is to ensure that people are not like trying to harm themselves in ways that they can't come back from. So it's really hard for me to like sum up what I'm trying to say, but
Yeah.
my goal is to just tap into those resources. If listening to this podcast can give you some sense of meaning, knowing that people are doing this work, I hope this is helpful. Yeah. And I want to thank C for having me on here.
No problem. Thank you for coming and being a guest. This week's episode touched on some difficult and potentially activating topics surrounding suicide and suicidal ideation. If you are currently struggling, you are not alone, and there are resources available to you, including the National Suicide and Crisis Lifeline 988 and the Trevor Project for those who are a part of the LGBTQIA2S community. You can reach the Trevor Project via their online chat on their website, thetrevorproject.org, calling 1-866-488-7386, or texting 678-678. Thank you and take care.